Welcome everyone to another episode of Two Geeks and a Marketing Podcast. As always, we're here to talk about the latest news, tech, content and wisdom from the world of marketing. And as always, my co-host is a man on a mission to demystify digital marketing. He's the host of the Content Marketing Studio video podcast. Please welcome Mr. Pascal Fintoni.
Well, thank you very much. And once again, a pleasure to spend more time with the man who's also on a mission to keep marketing simple, the voice of the Marketing and Finance podcast and the host of the Rogswell video series. I give you Monsieur Roger Edwards.
Oh, thank you so much, Pascal. And here we are with episode 46. 46. It's incredible how fast the time is going. But listen, thank you so much, everybody, for watching and listening to Two Geeks and a Marketing Podcast. We really do appreciate you taking the time to listening to what can be quite long episodes. And we offer no apology for the length of the episodes because we just enjoy talking about marketing and films, of course, so much. So, Pascal, shall we get straight into it? Shall we go into the news round?
Now, during a Euro 2020 press conference, Cristiano Ronaldo removed 2 bottles of Coca-Cola and replaced them with a bottle of water. This little act led to a $4 billion fall in the share price of the drinks company.
𝗂𝗵𝗲 and 𝗂𝗵𝗲 have pulled their advertisement from news broadcast channel GB News. The boycott was instigated by a social media campaign group, Stop Funding Hate, which urged brands to snub news organisations that promote divisive views.
Wow, well, YouTube is banning ads for gambling, alcohol and prescription drugs, as well as political and election-focused advertising from the top of its homepage.
And Chinese telecommunications brand Huawei has revealed that the British government's decision to ban it from the country's 5G network prompted a 27.5% drop in turnover for the company's UK subsidiary during the year to the end of December.
Well, Stella Artois, the famous beer brand, has joined a growing craze among celebrity athletes for virtual horse racing, Roger, by auctioning off 50 rare horses to coincide with the start of the esports summer season.
Social networks need to do more to stop fake reviews, Amazon says. The shopping site said it stopped more than 200 million suspected fake reviews last year, but cannot control those facilitated on social media.
Well, information about Windows 11, the new Microsoft operating system, has been leaked on the internet weeks before its official announcement at the What's Next for Windows event on June the 24th.
And finally, Spotify launches a Clubhouse competitor called The Green Room, which will let creators record live chats and turn them into podcasts. So, yeah, some really good and interesting news there, Pascal. Do you know, I'm convinced that I can remember Windows saying that Windows 10 would be the final version of Windows, and they'd just basically update that as time went by. But obviously, they've decided to launch a whole new version, Windows 11, which we'll have to see what that looks like. Now, I was going to ask you about the Euro 2020 press conference. Cristiano Ronaldo removing 2 bottles of Coke and replacing them with water, causing the brand to lose its share price. Now, interestingly enough, I was involved in another event yesterday, Pascal, and this very news item was discussed. And the view was that actually people like Ronaldo should be taking this sort of stand to encourage people to be more healthy, to drink better things, to eat better things. But I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I kind of read it several times. In fact, and then I went online to read, the details. And this is a marketing fiasco on 2 levels. Number one, yes, Coca-Cola is the official sponsor of Euro 2020, but they are not sponsoring Cristiano Ronaldo. And
Yes.
if you think about the layout of the press conference room and the way in which it was going to be filmed and framed, if you had a picture or video file of Cristiano Ronaldo sat with 2 bottles of Cokes in front of him, it could actually suggest that he's supported by, or at least advocating the use of the drinks. So that's number one. So as a marketing standpoint, it was a bit of a failure on the organizers. And number two, talk about accidental influencer marketing, because I think Cristiano Ronaldo said, almost briefed, no doubt, by his agent, she can't be seen sat next to these two bottles. So if the organizers don't remove them, you remove them. But then he kind of went further by brandishing the bottle of water. I don't know whether he did show the brand, and said aqua, in Spanish, for water. And suddenly this whole tsunami of reaction led to this 4 billion fall. Now, when you read the small print, that's only 1.6% of the overall value and turnover of the company. So I don't think it was a major dent, but it's the lasting effect of the PR that is going to be, making the news headlines and be first on the Google searches and more for the next weeks and months.
Yeah, I'm sure I also read, though, that the bottles of water that he pointed to were also manufactured by Coca-Cola. So I guess that he was removing one Coke brand and replacing it with another. But it's again, we hear all this stuff about cancel culture at the moment and influencer marketing. We've had a bit of a pop at that on the podcast so many times. And I don't know, we won't know the ins and outs of this about who sponsored what and what the actual deals were. And I can understand, yes, he perhaps doesn't want to be associated with Coca-Cola, but maybe they should have sorted it out before the filming started, rather than actually make it into a big issue.
Absolutely, that's my point. Really, you take a view. You're the organizer. You stand back and look at risk management. What could potentially happen? And I just thought it was a bit of a clumsy form of marketing, plonking bottles on the table like this. And I think there's better ways to showcase your product.
Absolutely right. So, looking at social networks needing to do more to stop fake reviews. This one caught my attention, Pascal, because I'd read recently, and this is pertinent to me having written 𝗏𝗲 and marketing plans in the last year or so, that quite a lot of authors are constantly having to appeal to Amazon to get 1-star reviews taken down, because there's almost like a network of people going on deliberately leaving 1-star reviews for competitor authors in order to reduce their rankings in some of the bestseller charts. And of course you would expect that this sort of thing goes on, but perhaps it's a lot more rife than I actually realised, and certainly to the tune of 200 million fake reviews is actually quite staggering. But as they say, they can't do anything about those that are effectively coming in via social media.
I just felt that the tone was a little I was perplexed by the tone, should I say, because we can't suggest that Amazon have got their house in order just yet. And I always don't. I mean, you and I will know, companies and traders who've complained and trying to contact Amazon for weeks and months to remove fake reviews, or to even be told, why is my product demoted? I don't understand. So I think if they'd said, we, as a kind of a global network of platforms and more, need to work together to make it better, I would have more sympathy. But to say, well, we are doing a good job, now your turn, I just think that the tone was a bit off. But the principle I would agree with. And indeed, for many of my customers, that's the reason why they were really turned off by the Google My Business, the Google Maps feature, because of all the fake reviews and complaints that were from either anonymous sources, which I think is where the problem lies, as well as being false.
Yeah, I have to say, you're right. Amazon needs to get its house in order, particularly on its customer service. I have to say that whilst I was going through the publishing process for my book, there were a number of things that I needed to get in touch with Amazon about, because I felt that the test printings of the book were slightly out of alignment. And honestly, trying to get to speak to a real person and to actually get over the problem was next to impossible. And the way that they reply to emails, and you can't then reply back to the email, you effectively go right back in with the initial contact form, you end up talking to 4, 5, 6 different people every time, and nobody knows the history of the issue, and you just go round and round and round. And in the end, I just thought, do you know what? I cannot be bothered with this anymore. I've wasted more than a whole couple of days just trying to get to speak to somebody in Amazon. It was a nightmare. So yeah, you're absolutely right. They need to get their house in order on their customer service. And the last one that I wanted to mention today was let's talk about another Clubhouse competitor. I nearly let this one go, but I thought it was quite interesting. Again, Spotify. One of the many criticisms that people had of the original Clubhouse was that, of course, the conversations disappear as soon as the room closes down, and you might have hours worth of what could have been incredibly good content, which just disappears and will never ever be seen again. Now, Twitter record their spaces and they keep them for a couple of days, but they only do that in case there's somebody complaining about something bad that happened within the space. But effectively, what Spotify doing here is letting you record it so that you can then turn it into a podcast. So it feels to me that this is adding to Spotify's almost push into the podcasting space.
I would agree. I know there's been a few weeks since we mentioned Clubhouse, so here they are back again. But that was the reason why I'd be looking at Twitter Spaces, but also looking at a way to record the conversation, because you have to repurpose, you have to extend its value beyond the live session. I'm excited about it. I mean, Spotify, I've done a lot of good things. I made right decisions in and around podcasting. We know that they also own Anchor.fm, so that would be also another way for you to record and add music from Spotify. There's so very, very interesting things happening at Spotify. For you and I, as consultants and trainers, what a surprise that we may end up having to recommend that people start using Spotify for their audio marketing.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because again, Spotify has just always been this. It's that music app, isn't it? It's what you sell all your old CDs and you start listening to Spotify. And now it's becoming a real quality content creation suite. So once again, Pascal, some great news items coming out here. And we could talk about all of them, but we do have time pressing upon us. So shall we move on to one of the best parts of the show, the content spotlights? In the content spotlight section of the show, Pascal and I bring to the table an item of content. It could be an article, podcast, video, something that's caught our attention in the recent weeks, and we dive into it in a bit of detail. So Pascal, what have you got for us today?
So, Roger, I'm not sure whether you've been keeping track of the show notes where we prepare, all the episodes for Two Geeks Marketing Podcast, but you may notice that this is not the article that I chose a couple of days ago. This article I discovered on my news app called Flipboard. I can't do without Flipboard. And this is a title for you. You can't show empathy over email. Business leaders turn to internal podcast to stay connected with their workforce. And whilst I was very happy with my initial choice, this one was so timely because I just had a conversation with a client of mine about launching what we call an in-house podcast. So this article was written by Jessica Davis, who is the UK editor of dgday.com, a media and news company that not only do they look at news about marketing and tech, they also have a podcast, they organize events, and they have a publishing arm. So quite a interesting, venue online for you to keep track of what's happening. But again, the title, but then the article was really, really insightful. Now, two reasons why I'm happy with my newer selection. Firstly, it's a wonderful example about how to write an article. So if you're interested, look at the structure, look at the setup, how the subject is being approached, look at the conclusion and everything in between. It's really quite interesting from a style point of view. But then let's look into the content, this idea of business leaders returning to audio to stay in touch with their workforce. So the premise is that, usually maintaining a strong and positive work culture, but also keeping employees emotionally engaged and motivated is difficult at the best of times, Roger, but then add onto that the pandemic and you have potentially a communications crisis where people are working remotely, everything that comes with it. So what the article is kind of suggesting is that, if not already, you need a change in leadership style, which has more empathy and more transparency. And what they are arguing is that the kind of still to this day old-fashioned use of the quarterly e-newsletter just won't do it anymore. So before I move on to tell you more about the content, I must ask you, Roger, have you had the pleasure of creating quarterly newsletters in your previous lives?
Actually, it's funny. The last big corporate that I worked for was already harnessing this sort of technique to communicate with its staff. So maybe it was ahead of its time. Now, when I was working there, I didn't particularly feel like that. It was called the Cascade, which I hated the title of, and the idea being that the messages cascaded down from the CEO. So the initial version of the Cascade was the CEO talking to the senior managers, who then did another cascade down to the people below. And it was all recorded on video and audio, and then people would be given the choice of actually attending the next version in person to watch the video, listen to the audio, or just watch it on their PCs at their desks. And I think most people actually opted to stay at their desks and either pretend to watch it or pretend to listen to it. I don't know what. But it at least it wasn't an email. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I think you've got to be so careful how you word emails, haven't you? I mean, you can annoy people inadvertently by using the wrong tense or the wrong structure or just the wrong words, whereas real face-to-face, it's harder to be mean to people when you actually have to be looking at them in the eyes when you're talking.
Yeah. No, I mean, for me, I've done my fair share of quarterly newsletters across my life as an employee, and they were a pain just to get the news out of people. It was a pain to produce, it was a pain to distribute, and they never had the impact or the desired effect from the leaders. So this article is perhaps not saying you should do away with the quarterly newsletter, but what they're saying is that there is a limit to what the written word, to your point, Roger, can convey at the time where people need to feel more connected and feel more included as we work more remotely. And bear in mind the recent conversation, Roger, as we perhaps approaching towards a hybrid working practices. So the article then move on to giving examples of the audio content. So you have, for example, sales team leaders. They've switched from Zoom meetings to a short podcast to give people an update. You have the onboarding of new employees, where you have welcome messages and more from staff that some of the new employees may not meet for quite some time. You have people who are also invited from external guests giving insights and giving a bit of tutorials to stimulate what's happening. You even have, of course, the CEO being interviewed to share their career progress. And then you have the product team describing the new product features or service features so that the customer-facing staff can convey that message to the customers, but all done so that people can listen to it as a podcast. And what I like about it, and the other examples you'll see in this article, is that the majority of the podcasts, internal podcasts, are not produced by the leaders, but they are produced by team members working at the lower echelons. And therefore, they're also given the freedom to have fun with it, which I think is important. So some of them are mixing current affairs, pop culture, music, film, maybe, as well as the news about the business. And they have different styles and different voices. They even have names for them. So you have a company where they have the virtual water cooler, because they know that most of the conversations are happening in around the coffee machine or the water cooler. And the article really make a strong case for this idea of, why don't you try that for a while? Because we need to all of us as human beings, that the sense of connection and belonging. And there's something very intimate, as you know, Roger, about consuming audio and listening to it, even though maybe doing something else. The article finishes with some very interesting stats about the impact of the pandemic on one's morale and motivation, sense of belonging, but also then flips it by saying, well, this is the positive outcome of using internal podcast. I'm going to close this kind of quick summary and encourage everybody to follow the link below to read the article. You'll see a superb style format, but also great content with a quote from one of the interviewees for this article, the CMO of Workvivo, who is actually a platform and solution to engage a staff that working in remote locations. So this is the quote: "The core problem with regard to what's happening right now is a lack of meaningful connections, meaningful bonds and relationships, the kind that are formed in an office environment or bumping into the CEO or senior team members in a parking lot and getting a pat on the back for a job well done."
Yeah.
So here we are. Internal podcast, which can be used for this, but then I want to extend this reaction and your comments about, should it be also part of maybe extending event experience? Could it be used for so many different ways, but allowing this idea of for your ears only podcast, as opposed to when people think of podcast, which is more of a public listening?
Yeah, I when I was managing director of Bright Grey and Scottish Provident many years ago, I was very into the senior management team always being visible. So we used to do a weekly, we used to call it team talk, where we used to get everybody together and the senior managers would be there in person. And then quarterly we would do a bigger event, a sort of town hall type thing, they tend to call them these days, although that's a terminology I'm not particularly keen on. But I suppose now that we're in this new world of virtual and many businesses aren't all congregated in one place, you just don't have the staff on the same site, then some sort of digital alternative is absolutely essential. But then you think about it, is video the best route or is audio? And again, we've talked about Clubhouse, we've talked about podcasts. You can't get away from the fact that there's something quite intimate about audio only. Plugging in your headphones, you're still getting close to the people who are talking. And maybe that is the advantage of an audio podcast, is it has that feeling of intimacy that maybe even video doesn't have. And maybe that's where, if you've got a good person who is good at putting a message across audibly, then maybe there is that element of empathy that will strengthen the team spirit.
The other thing that I've just realized listening to you is remembering my work as a video producer is I cannot imagine that for many people, audio would be less off-putting and scary, either as a host or as a guest. Because, I've been there where the person you want to interview or the person that is part of the panel discussion is just feeling a little nervous about being seen, actually oddly more than heard. And I wonder whether also it removes that barrier and makes actually the content production just smoother and more enjoyable for all.
Yeah, I think you're right. So, Pascal, we've said this on a number of occasions that we don't collaborate in advance on our content spotlights.
We do
not. We don't. And honestly, listeners and viewers, we genuinely don't. And yet it staggers me that frequently, and it's going to happen again today, we seem to home in on similar topics and similar ideas. And my content spotlight this week is an article, again, that I've found in Inc. online magazine, INC, as opposed to INK. And the heading of the article is, "If you say these 5 phrases often, you're a better leader than you think."
Okay.
And using them regularly will result in an increase in trust. And that's pretty much building upon what your piece of content has been talking about. It's all about how can the people who lead organizations communicate better and be better leaders rather than just authoritarian managers giving out orders, not having empathy, not having the human touch. And again, as is quite common with my recent content spotlights, it's an article. It's not a very long article. Maybe at the moment I'm homing in on smaller bite-sized pieces of content. But great article by Marcel Schwantes. I think I've pronounced that right. I hope I have. But let me just talk you through. These are the things that he's saying, that if you are a empathetic leader, if you do have the human touch, then these are the sort of things that you'll find yourself saying. So, for example, we couldn't have pulled off this project without your help. So notice the we couldn't, i.e. the collective we, the business, and without your help. So immediately you've got that connection. Whereas, quite a lot of business leaders almost like take the credit for it all themselves. You would think they'd done it all on their own. And it's just a subtle use of language, isn't it, Pascal? But that really does create that empathetic link with the employee. Here's another one. I could use your advice on what to do in this situation.
Nice.
Wow. I mean, I can remember so many times, going in and sitting with my senior manager or my director when I was working in big corporate. And it's almost, maybe it's just something that was drummed into that generation of people. You can't admit that you don't know the answer. And, the fact that they would call you in and say, do you know, I don't know the answer to this. Can you help me out? It would just never happen. They would probably fail rather than admit that they didn't know, or at least they'd pretend they knew, and then they go away and look it up, and then they come back and again show off their wonderful amount of knowledge. But just listen to that sentence. I could use your advice on what to do in this situation. Number 3, and this is just beautiful. What can I do to help? What can I do to help? And as consultants, Pascal, you and I are saying these phrases quite a lot because that's how we work, and we are often here to help people to reach their goals, to create strategies and everything. But sometimes you just don't get this from the leaders of corporates. Number 4, that was clearly my mistake. Wow, again, there's so much humanity in that. And again, we're conditioned almost on a daily basis, especially, you hear this from politicians. They never, ever admit mistakes, do they? In fact, I'm always saying that politics is the great example of how to use passive language to effectively dodge responsibility. They'll say things like mistakes were made, but when you use a passive language like that, it implies that the mistake were made by other people, as opposed to saying we made mistakes. Whereas this guy is saying that was clearly my mistake. And the last one, number 5, and again, this is beautifully simple, and I cannot recall many occasions where I've heard bosses in corporates say this: I don't know. I don't know. But just think how many issues and problems could be solved if people were just honest, put their hands up and say, do you know what? I don't know. Let's work it out together. And actually, Pascal, that's pretty much it. The article is nice and short. It's punchy. You're going to be able to read it in a minute and a half. It's not long. But wow, those 5 phrases to me, you almost feel that people should be tattooing them on their forehead or onto their wrist or something like that. What do you think?
What is delightful is, as I'm listening to you, I'm literally having this kind of flashbacks of my life as an employee, and then more recently, of course, as a consultant. So, I started my career in marketing in the mid-90s. It's a bit scary that I can't even give you the year anymore, Roger. So, memory's fading. But I'm going to say mid-90s, 94, 95, I reckon. And as I'm listening to you, I feel very fortunate that I've had bosses like this. I feel very fortunate that my very first boss, a man called Andy Tidy, showed me the way of being a leader and a boss, and he had all these wonderful qualities. Interestingly, then years later, I had some, let's say, not as good team leaders and bosses. So it's also nice to be able to contrast. And with age, you kind of forgive and forget, the kind of mistakes and so on. But even more recently, when I was helping one of my clients and joined them on a full-time occupation, a company called 𝗬𝗵𝗲, and what you've just listed, I observed and witnessed with delight during the senior management team meetings and board meetings. So there's 2 ways which I would use that almost. I would say to employees, read this article and realize how lucky you are to have a great leader, because you'll be able to use that as a barometer. But also, sadly, if you're not, you don't have the pleasure of good, kind of human-centered leadership, don't be afraid to start to think about moving on, because life is too short and a career should be built by being a company of people that are true inspiration. But isn't that funny that it's also pretty damn simple though, isn't it?
It is. And again, it comes back to all what we say a lot on this show. Simplicity wins, but simplicity is very hard to do. And that's why so many things end up being complicated. And, again, the fact that you and I have picked a similar topic this week is fabulous. But I think we can never, ever underestimate the power of empathy and the power of having that human touch. Be more human, I think Mark Schaefer may have once said. And, you can make your relationships with your staff so much more powerful and so much lead to more success if you actually simplify it and make it human.
I think for me, sorry to interrupt, Roger. There's been a lot said about the pandemic, and it's linked to digital transformation, which had some merit. But I think we should also say that the pandemic has really accelerated the humanization of the world of work, which was already there with the young generation of leaders and team leaders. Back to your point, we do not use the same sources of news and information when we choose the content spotlight. We don't, we have different habits, we have different apps and so on. And it just is very intriguing to me in a good way that time and time again we have something very similar, because ultimately we are the mirror of the mood and mindset of the world of business at large. And clearly there's something happening out there for the subject to be making the headlines again.
Yeah, absolutely. So great content spotlights once again. So thanks for that, Pascal. Shall we move on now? And let's talk about the latest marketing tech and apps. In this section of the show, Pascal and I bring to the table the latest marketing apps and platforms that have caught our attention, things that will enrich our business lives and make us more productive and maybe make us more healthy. So Pascal, what have you discovered this week?
So this is actually the result of a research project I kind of gave myself a week or so ago. It's all to do with planning my new video tutorials and video content, but also I've been invited a few times to do some kind of how-to guides, how to use a platform, how to maybe use Spotify in future to do podcasting and the likes. And within that, I need to therefore record my screen and do a show and tell about how to use the different bells and whistles of a platform. Now, I've been an attendee of those tutorials. Indeed, like you have been watching a lot of video tutorials, but sometimes it's actually quite hard to keep track of what the other person is doing. Sometimes the screen is just too detailed, or sometimes we can't quite make out the different fills and boxes and ticks that they are doing. So I'll be looking at apps that can allow me to highlight the mouse more, but also to zoom into the area where I'm working on the different platforms. So that's been essentially what I've been doing, because crazily, I'm already planning the next iteration of the content marketing studio for September, but try and be a good boy and plan in advance. So my research is, I wouldn't say it's complete, because as ever, the more you look, the more you find, but I give myself a deadline. I say by this date, you'll have a short list, and then you start to use them. And if you outgrow those apps, you can move on to doing more research, which I think is very good advice for viewers and listeners, because you could spend days, indeed weeks, but you have to make a decision eventually. So what I tend to do, which is the advice I give my customers, I give myself a time budget, Roger. So I say, this is your time budget for the research, and by the end of which you'll make a decision. So I've got one option for Mac users, and I've got one option for Windows users, which soon will have to go on to Windows 11. I forgot to tease you about that one, Roger, earlier. So for the Mac user, I've got something called 𝗲𝗲, which is portmanteau yet again, Roger, between maths and expose from a company called 𝗲𝗶𝗶𝗶. And there's a free version, there's a chargeable version. They're only asking for like £10 a year. and it will highlight your mouse as a pointer. It will also shade the area that you don't want to show. So if you click on the box, for example, if you want to highlight a particular part of a website or an application, to make it even easier to understand what you do, it would kind of make the whole area around it shaded. You can zoom in, you can do all sorts of things, which is really quite nice. So 𝗏𝗲 is for Mac users. For Windows users, you've got Pointer Focus by a company called 𝗖𝗍𝗄𝗄, which stands for Easy to Use Software, 𝗖𝗍𝗄𝗄. And what they've done is something very similar, whereby, the mouse it can be a bit bigger, or the design can be changed. You can highlight what you're doing with a little halo effect. You can zoom in and out, and make simply your tutorial, your step-by-step guide, just a bit clearer, just a bit more interesting to follow along. And also, will require little to no editing. So these are the two options. Just before I pass on to you, Roger, one thing I did learn through my research is, surprisingly, there are already potentially some features you can use within your own computer, whether it's a Mac or a Windows PC. Do actually investigate, because sometimes as part of the when you get different packages, there are versions of the mouse highlighter or cursor highlighter. So that's one thing to look into. But also, if you are using a screen recording app, no matter what it is, whether it's a browser extension or a third-party software, they sometimes have also tucked away that kind of mouse highlighter function that you're looking for. So perhaps you should begin there. And if you're not liking what you see, then do consider 𝗏𝗲 for the Mac users and Pointer Focus for Windows users.
This is really funny, actually, Pascal. Yesterday, I had to record a Zoom call for which was actually going to be put out as a YouTube video later. And as we know, the video quality of Zoom can be a bit hit and miss. And so what I have to do is I have to use OBS Studio to effectively record the screen in 4K and then synchronize the audio from Zoom with the better quality video. But the problem with OBS is it will record everything that's on the screen. That includes me moving the mouse up to change it to gallery view, or moving the mouse up to click on the mute button. So I had to go looking for the functionality within OBS Studio to actually get rid of the mouse cursor from the recording. So it just goes to show that while some people might want that, other people have reasons why they want to take it away. My apps this week, I totally found this all by accident. Now, I've talked about an app I use on the show before. It's called Day One, and it's like a journaling app. And I've been using this now for about 5 years. And what I love about it is that every day it tells me what I did on this day over the last 5 years. And it just made me curious to think about other journaling apps. But then I remembered a brand called Moleskine. Now, Moleskine traditionally put together actual physical journals, ones that you can write in with pens. Remember those?
I do.
And I always remember seeing these Moleskine journals in airports or in train stations. And they're really nice, really, really well produced. And they always have a very attractive leather cover, or, as the name would suggest, made out of some sort of skin or something like that. And they're very expensive. These journals, which effectively are just a notebook with a leather cover, you can be talking about £10 to £15 to buy one of these. So I've never really felt the need to buy a very expensive notebook along those lines. But it made me think about, I wonder whether Moleskine have done anything digital. So I went on, and of course they have. And Moleskine have created, there's about 5 apps in the suite, but the two that caught my attention are Moleskine Time Page and Moleskine Journey. And Time Page is effectively a calendar type of app, so it will do your schedule for you. But what I really like about it is that they've put a lot of work into integrating the features that you might have on your iPhone or your Android device, like the weather thing perhaps, or even the step measurement that you have on the health app on the iPhone. So for example, if you put into the time page that you've got a meeting, so I've got a meeting at the other end of Princes Street, say in Edinburgh, it will work out for me based upon steps that people have taken, not just me, but if the data's shared, it will work out how long it would take me to walk from Edinburgh Waverley Station to the other end of Princes Street, and it will build that walking time on either side of the meeting, which I thought was quite clever. It will also build in what the weather's going to be like. So if it's a downpour, you might want to get a taxi or something like that. So they've really done some really interesting trickery and integrated stuff. The second one is called Moleskine Journey, which is a similar sort of app, but it's more orientated towards people who are going on trips, whether that's holidays or business trips. And it does similar things like I've already described. It includes the weather. It'll try to work out how long it'll take you to get from point A to point B. It'll integrate into the app reviews from hotels, like hotels.com or booking.com. So I thought this is real interesting stuff, and the way that they've integrated everything together. But here's the thing. Each of these apps is very expensive, and you're talking about the annual charge is something like 49 quid, 50 quid effectively. So in the same way as you're going to pay a lot of money for that journal you can hold in your hand because it's got that lovely leather cover, these apps are very clever, but you're also going to pay a price for them. And I guess what I like about this is that Moleskine are one of the brands that can get away with being expensive, reassuringly expensive, as they used to say about Stella Artois. And they've built a brand around quality. And if you want that quality, then you're going to have to pay for it.
I like as well the evolution from a physical item to a digital, and how they could have fallen into the trap of making an online version of the physical item, which is essentially just pages that you could fill in, a la, Google Jamboards or Google Keep, but they've done something extra and almost merging in additional text and information. I think it's very clever, and you're right. It's a good case study about positioning in terms of your marketing and your pricing.
Excellent. And as we always say, we rely so much on all of these apps to enrich our business lives and to enrich our personal lives. So it's always a pleasure to shout some of these out on the show. Pascal, we also know that a lot of the things that we rely on today wouldn't be around, wouldn't be happening if it wasn't from the pioneers from history who've created all sorts of things and gadgets for us to play with. So let's fire up the flux capacitor, set the controls for the past, and move on to this week in history.
In 1509, Henry VIII, at the age of 17, is crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, London, becoming the second king from the House of Tudor.
In 1868, the Scholes and Glidden typewriter is patented with its QWERTY keyboard, which is still the most popular keyboard layout in the world.
In 1946, French designer Louis Réard unveils a daring two-piece swimsuit he called a bikini, inspired by the news of the US atomic test that took place off the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific Ocean earlier that week.
In 1960, the first contraceptive pill is made available for purchase in the United States.
In 1981, For Your Eyes Only, the 12th James Bond movie, the 5th starring Roger Moore and the first to be directed by John Glenn, premieres at London's Odeon Theatre.
In 1989, the movie Batman premieres, directed by Tim Burton and starring Michael Keaton and Jack Nicholson. The film also launched the Batmania phenomenon with over $750 million worth of merchandise sold.
In 1997, a US Air Force official released a 231-page report entitled The Roswell Report Case Closed, dismissing long-standing claims that an alien spacecraft crashed in Roswell, New Mexico, almost exactly 50 years earlier.
In 2010, the longest match in tennis history between American John Isner, and he defeated Nicolas Mahut of France at Wimbledon, and the match lasted 11 hours and 5 minutes of play over 3 days. And I think as a result of that, they changed the whole structure of a tennis match now so that it can only go up to a certain number of games.
I remember it well.
It was something ridiculous, like 1885, 83 or something.
I remember it well. It was, because are they still playing?
Yeah. Incredible. Now, this isn't the earliest historical item that we've talked about on the show, but it is quite early. But I had to highlight Henry VIII. I don't know what it is about the Tudor era, Pascal. It was always my favourite era of history. And I just think that Henry VIII, the story of Henry VIII and his 6 wives, is just incredible. And let's face it, it's been turned into so many TV shows, so many films, books, plays, whatever it is. So it is a very, very famous part of history. And again, the fact that he had to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and therefore fell out with the Catholic Church, fell out with the Pope, created an entire new subgenre of religion, the UK Protestant movement, I guess. So he effectively changed history.
And what is interesting is the character that really has inspired book authors, playwrights, filmmakers, and so on, because he was kind of conflicted. One, he was actually someone that was talented, that was thinking ahead in terms of changing and improving society in general. He was embracing the early signs of technology and so on, but he was also just foul-tempered, as we know, and had a very complicated love life, as we also know too well.
Yeah, and again, it's interesting. One of my favourite bands from the past is prog rock group Jethro Tull, which are famous for their sort of flute style rock music, and they have a piece of music which I thought was them doing a dedication to Henry VIII. The song's called King Henry's Madrigal, and it's actually quite a catchy piece of music. It's got a nice flute line to it, nice bass line, and quite a lot of sort of medieval style drumming. But I actually found that when I researched that piece of music, I was shocked to find out that it wasn't actually written by Jethro Tull. It was actually written by Henry VIII himself, and they were doing effectively a modern version of this. And if you do go looking around on YouTube, you can find some traditional orchestras who've actually replicated the song as it would have been played in Henry VIII's time, using lutes and flutes and all of that sort of thing. So fabulous. I just absolutely love that period of history. And if you ever get asked in a quiz question, the best way to remember the what happened to the wives, there's that little poem, isn't there? It's not even a poem, it's just a series of words. So it's divorced, beheaded, died, divorce, beheaded, survived. Now, 1981, For Your Eyes Only.
One of my favorite Roger Moore's movie for a number of reasons, but I just think the story is wonderful. The song is great as well. And John Glenn, who then went on to direct many more James Bond movies, it just, brilliant. And I think it also captured the 80s. It was 81, but they switched it in terms of tone and style, which I think was a very, very smart move.
Yeah, it's funny. My wife and I have recently been having a mini Bond binge. Now, during the first lockdown, we actually watched all 24 James Bond films back to back. This time we've picked what we are calling our selected gems from each of the eras, and For Your Eyes Only, in my opinion, is probably the best of the Roger Moore Bond films. And you're right, they went from the science fiction out of space, complete and outrageous fantasy of Moonraker, and For Your Eyes Only brought it all back down to earth, and it was all proper spying again and proper espionage and that sort of thing. And you just can't beat that. And some fabulous snow chases and scenery and that sort of thing. John Glenn, again, as you say, needs a shout out. I think he directed 5 Bond films. I think he directed the last 3 Roger Moore's and both Dalton films, I think. So yeah, he is very accomplished, very accomplished. And the last one I wanted to talk about, Pascal, is the Roswell report, dismissing these claims that there had been a spacecraft crashed in Roswell and it had aliens in it. And we've seen the footage, haven't we, whether it's fake or made up or whatever. But do you think that this ever happened and it was indeed covered up, or was the whole thing just an elaborate hoax?
It's tricky. I think about it often because it's on TV. It makes the news. Sometimes it's also part of a movie story. So one of my guilty pleasures on the Sunday afternoon, if I want to fall asleep, I watch Paul with Nick Frost and Simon Pegg, and they do visit the place. I do believe that there was testing of flying aircraft flying in different ways. And I do think that there was a crash. And of course, the army have been trying to keep hidden not just the accident, but also the technology, because there's just too many witnesses. And I just find it interesting that someone would want to write such an extensive report to say it's not true.
Yes, yeah. It's almost too much of a signpost in the other direction, isn't it?
Fair attempt on the title, the Roswell report, case closed, as in before you even read anything, as far as we're concerned, nothing happened. And I think for me, something did happen. And this attempt to cover it up has allowed people to let their imagination run wild. As to whether or not there was aliens on the spacecraft amount, I don't think that was the case.
No, I think you're right. I think, it's become just urban legend, hasn't it? That a lot of people will believe, in the same way some people believe that the COVID vaccine is injecting you with magnetic particles at Bill Gates' behest. But hey, the last one, I wasn't actually going to mention this, but it is worth a little mention, is the bikini. Now, isn't it amazing that an iconic piece of fashion design, I guess, is actually named after an island where they effectively tested a nuke? I always think that's quite staggering.
Well, I think there was two things. The designer wanted to be irreverent and almost flip it. Maybe it's an early form of newsjacking, a term that I've not used for a while. So obviously, I fully approve of the design. As to the fact that all these years later, it's still an item that people will know and use. That's a long time. I don't know many items like the fashion that have stood the test of time to the degree that this has.
No, again, very, very iconic. Another fabulous reminiscence of all these amazing things that took place in history that shape the world that we live in today. So, Pascal, I think it's time for us to give some creators shout-outs. And in this section of the show, Pascal, give a shout out to some of our creator friends. Now, normally they're within our network, sometimes slightly outside of our network. So, Pascal, who is in your shout out spotlight this week?
So perhaps an unusual selection for this week. I would say maybe inspired by your also very unique selection of last week. But as you know, I've been in the UK 30 years. I did receive my settled status letter as well, so I am allowed to stay as a French national. But 30 years later, I now partake in this national pastime of commenting on the weather a lot, as most British citizens do. And on my phone for the last few years, or ever since I've had a smartphone, I have this app called AccuWeather, which I suspect is a portmanteau yet again of accurate and weather. And I was using it to know whether or not I should plan to do more gardening for the next few days, and discovered by pure accident that they have a podcast series. And that just threw me a little, because I've known this app, as I mentioned, for many, many years, as simply tell me whether it's going to rain, tell me whether my hay fever is going to kick in. But I've never thought of them as content creators. So they do have podcast series hosted by Din DeVore, Bernie Rayno, 𝗖𝗵𝗲 and colleagues that keep changing. And the reason why I chose them is because I do believe that this is a wonderful source of inspiration for people who think that they operate in boring industry, or they do what they do. What can I possibly talk about? What could possibly be interesting to others? So the way the team at 𝗬𝗓 have done this is through three series. One called Everything Under the Sun, which are interviews where they bring the idea of weather and a supplementary topic. So things like a return to the garden and summer pests. So they have experts in gardening to tell you how to deal with weeds and the likes. They have also things like the new lightning capital of America, talking about what is happening, and hurricanes and wildfire, to explain how they happen and the science behind it. So they tend to be half-hour type interviews. Then they have Weather Insider, which is a shorter form of podcasting with one kind of voice, but they explain weather terms, they explain the science behind weather, the work, the kind of the typical day for meteorologists, and provide you some weather news. And they have a third series, which may ring a bell, Roger, This Date in Weather History. and they talk about events that have happened that have marked society. So, for example, in 1859, temperature reaches 56 degrees Celsius in Santa Clara, California. I mean, honestly, that place is just doomed, isn't it, Santa Clara? And then in 1939, this one is known in the UK, frogs fell from the sky during a rainstorm in Towbridge, England. So These are the three things they do. And I just thought, that's just clever. That's just the kind of things that I want to add to the Creator's Shoutouts, because I do think if you're listening and you've dismissed your company, your sector, your industry from a content creation point of view, just take a hint from those people here. The weather, you could argue, what is there to say about it? But here you go. Everything Under the Sun, interviews, Weather Insider, tell me more about your kind of day-to-day. And then you are part of an industry that has a history. So This Date in Weather History is also something you could look into.
Oh, it's fantastic, isn't it? And us Brits love talking about the weather, don't we? I mean, it's usually the second thing that most people say to each other after "How are you doing?" or "Hello." It's "What's the weather like with you?" So it's absolute genius the way that they've linked it into that 𝗬𝗓 theme. I love that. Now, my shout out is not somebody from my network, but as you know, I occasionally dive into looking at how to use humour, especially in talks, sometimes within articles and that sort of thing. And I came across this podcast. It's called the Humorology Podcast by a gentleman called Paul Boros or Boris. Apologies again if I've mispronounced that. And this guy interviews some fairly heavyweight people from across the world, but they're not the normal people you would expect to see on the sort of podcast that we listen to. So it's not generally loads of marketing people. So I've actually been delighted to hear completely different personalities. So it's anybody from Ainsley Harriott, who's a fairly famous UK chef. We've had William Hague, who was once the leader of the Tory party in the United Kingdom. Alistair Campbell, who was one of Labour's great big sort of Dominic Cummings style advisors from the past. Also Marcus Brigstock, who's a improv comedian. So you've got some real heavy hitters here, and they just analyse humour. Whether it's a political speech, whether it's an after-dinner speech, they talk about how to talk at weddings, they talk about stand-up, they talk about improv, they talk about humour in films, and it's just how the humour develops, either whether it's scripted or whether it's observational. And I've just found this something completely different. I started listening to it purely to get ideas for adding humour to some of my talks and presentations, but actually it's now a podcast that I just listen to because it's good, if that makes sense.
Super.
And one of the things that has, out of the British people that I've listened to, like the aforementioned Marcus Brigstock, William Hague, Alistair Campbell, etc., there's a common theme that comes out, that they think that one of the best storytellers, one of the best comedians that we've ever had is Billy Connolly.
Ah.
And that his name comes up very often, and again that prompted me to go off and watch a load of Billy Connolly videos. And I'll probably use that as a different content spotlight in the future. But yeah, the Humorology podcast, well worth a listen, whether you're into humor or not. It's just a damn good podcast.
Well, that's two great options today, and I think what we do this for our viewers and listeners is to inspire you to be just a bit more ambitious and daring with your own content, but also to add to your podcast listening lists.
Absolutely. So, Pascal, we are heading towards the end of the show, and that means we are about to head into our favourite section of the show, and that is film marketing. So our film this week is an incredibly funny film, Pascal. It's also a gangster film. It's an ensemble cast film. It's also one of those films that sometimes plays around with different timelines so that things happen in sequence and then sometimes they happen out of sequence. And it's also one of those films where different stories sort of interweave with each other, but some characters within the film actually never interact intentionally within the film. So this is Snatch from the year 2000, directed by Guy Ritchie and starring just about everybody else. Jason Statham, who's one of my favourite action heroes now. Stephen Graham, who's become incredibly famous recently with his roles in Line of Duty and the more recent series Time about a prison officer. Lenny James, who's gone on to be in Walking Dead and Fear the Walking Dead. Vinnie Jones, who used to be a footballer, now an actor. Brad Pitt, doing the most incredible sort of Irish gypsy type accent you've ever heard. Alan Ford, who is the archetypal East End gangster. Benicio del Toro, who was actually in the aforementioned James Bond film, the second James Bond film with Timothy Dalton, directed by John Glenn. Wow. And Dennis Farina, he's been in loads of things.
I just love this guy.
And Mike Reed, who was in EastEnders for a long time. So wow, Snatch has got so many actors in it.
Indeed, and well done for remembering all of them and more. Jason Fleming. The list, I feel guilty of. I feel we should mention everybody, including Matthew Vaughn, the producer, because talk about a labour of love. Talk about pure indie filmmaking, pure British grit in making the film happen. But also, now that we have the luxury of watching the making of and behind the scenes, they had a blast making Snatch.
Yeah, and as you say, it is incredibly funny. I find the script is one of those pieces of perfection where there's almost not a line that doesn't advance the plot, but also it's so well written. And some of the humour, again, is visual humour. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to talk about many of the jokes because actually the language in the film is pretty explicit. Pretty much every other word is an F word or a C word or something. But a lot of the humour, I find, actually comes out of the use of expletives because they use it in a way, I don't know what I'm trying to say, whereas it doesn't actually feel as offensive as it might do in other circumstances.
It's almost the Irish lilt of using a feck, as they do in Father Ted and so on.
Yes.
And I think you're right, the writing is such that when there is, the swear word, which is why I'm sure Guy Ritchie and Matthew Vaughn are pleased that 20 years later they retain their 18th certificate from the BBFC. The language is part and parcel of the character's identity and, of course, the world that they live in. What I love about the film is it's really clever. I mean, at first watch, one could say a bit dated, a bit this, a bit that. But actually, if you really stop for a moment, I realize how complex the storylines are doing. You talk about the storylines and characters almost never quite meeting, although they cross each other without realizing. That takes serious storyboarding, that takes serious scripting. I mean, I imagine they had a whiteboard with all the Post-its, everything to make sure that they didn't mess it up. And as we're going to talk about in a moment, Guy Ritchie, I'd imagine being the director on this occasion, Matthew Vaughn, the producer, really claimed his visual storytelling style. And for me, is what we would say in French cinema is an auteur, is an author. the way he chooses to film, edit, and project, the story is unique to him, and it belongs to this generation of filmmakers who really make a difference.
Yeah, and again, a lot of the humour often comes just from the expressions on the actors' faces. I mean, there's one scene quite early on, and I can talk about this because there actually isn't any dialogue. They're actually in a getaway car, and one of the characters is called Tyrone, and he's a fairly sizable gentleman. He's quite large, and he's got a very thick leather coat on. So they're talking about being a getaway driver, and this guy takes about 30 seconds to get out of the car because he's so big, and his leather jacket's squeaking and rustling and scraping against the side of the car. But it's the expressions of the two other people in the car, this sort of combination of disbelief and, you're supposed to be a getaway driver, and look at you.
You can't even get out of the car.
And, when I watch that scene, I'm absolutely rolling around, laughing my head off. And, some people might think, what's funny about that? But it's the looks on these guys' faces. And it's things like that all the way through the film. You look at the people and the way they react to the situation, and that's funny in itself.
It's very funny because actually pretty much every single character, with the exception of Mickey, are just hapless, incompetent gangsters.
Yes.
Maybe Bricktop, we're going to come on to because you always need a good villain. But you've got Saul, Tyrone, and Vincent who want to rob people and be rich. And they have Tyrone, who is the getaway driver who can't get out of the car, can't even drive and park properly. So if you remember the scene where they want to rob the bookies and he parks really far away, and they say, well, why are you not parked there? Because there's not enough room. He doesn't know how to do essentially a reverse car parking. Yeah. And so you've got this kind of lunacy of people. So in the case of Turkish, played by Jason Statham, and Tommy with Stephen Graham, they want to become big, successful, wealthy boxing promoters, and they use illegal boxing as a shortcut. And unfortunately for them, enter the world of Bricktop, who eventually has something on them.
Yes. I mean, Bricktop is, just to me, the archetypal sort of British villain. He's got that just glorious Cockney accent, real deep East End thug type accent. Incidentally, Alan Ford went on to do a series of sketches as the East End thug in the Orlando 𝗖𝗍𝗄𝗄 TV series a number of years later, and he's basically Bricktop, but he's doing all sorts of different scenes, so that's always worth going to see. But the actor is as scary as hell. I mean, he's got his great big glasses on, which make his eyes look big. He's got the big teeth, and then combined with that Cockney accent, I just think the guy is as scary as hell.
That delivery, and what is interesting about the film, so there's a moment where you realize these are larger-than-life characters. This is almost a fantasy. You can imagine that Guy Ritchie had heard the stories told in pubs, but they've been embellished and amplified. By the 10th time he's heard the story, the characters have changed. And I love this idea of being over the top. But there's a moment in the film where you get a massive slap in the face where it turns, where Bricktop essentially takes action. And I'm not sure whether we can say more if you have not seen Snatch, but the moment I mean, where he goes on to make sure that people understand that he's in charge. Yes. And that really shocked me, because up to that point, there's an element of humor, comedy, almost fantasy. And then suddenly you're brought back down to earth with this act of violence. I kind of go, crap, this guy is dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I also find that the directional style is quite intriguing as well. Quite a lot of things actually happen off screen. There's one bit where you've got Bullet Tooth Tony, and he's got the accomplice is a guy who comes over from America with Dennis Farina, and this big guy saying, it's okay, I'll take him on, and I'll beat him up. And then literally the next scene is them in the back of the car with this guy who was just saying, I'll take him on. He's got blood all over his face, and he's obviously taken him on and had the crap beaten out of him. But all of that happened off screen. I don't know whether it was ever filmed or whether it was intentionally like that. But you think, Guy Ritchie's such a good storyteller, he decided we didn't actually need to see that bit.
And so let's go back to that, Roger. Forgive me, 20 years ago, if you watch the first 10 minutes of Snatch, in there, you've got all the editing skills and transition skills that vloggers are claiming they have invented. And I'm sorry to say, for all of you, 2000, that is to say 6 years before YouTube, Guy Ritchie was doing the transitions, the panning, the cutting, the rotation, everything that you, forgive me, younger people out there think you have invented. If you want to be good at video editing, watch a Guy Ritchie movie. But would you agree that the whole opening sequence after the robbing of the sort of bank, as it is I suppose a store, and then the transition to the different characters and the freeze framing and so on is just spectacular, and again would have been very hard to do in 2000.
Yeah, and one thing that stands out for me is his use of monitors. In the early scene you've described there, where the baddies are going into the jewelry store or whatever it is. The first few scenes actually take place on monitors, don't they? And he pans down to each monitor, and each monitor is obviously a security monitor monitoring a different part of the store. So you see them walking through, you see them in the lift, you see them coming through the door. But throughout the film, there are monitors. Now, again, the aforementioned scene where you said Bricktop goes and starts getting very violent. There's a scene where he walks into the room, but in the background you can see him actually on a monitor before he enters the scene, and it's just little things like that. Just genius.
It's part of the language. It's a wonderful leitmotif. What I love as well, what Guy Ritchie did in this film, is show with limitation comes ingenuity and innovation. And I think many of the things that you see, it was because they were stuck for short of time, short of budget. So the jump cut, which can be deemed to be quite severe. And for me, it's back to this idea of, it's a fantasy tale and you can afford to do that. But I was also reminiscing about this idea of, can you imagine if someone get in touch with you and say, I've written this film, I would like you to be Frankie Four Fingers.
Yes.
I've written this film, I'd like you to be Boris the Blade. I mean, just that. You don't have to read the script, you just agree to it, wouldn't you?
Yeah, Doug the Head. It's just joyous. Cousin Avi. I absolutely love it. And even every time Avi goes across the Atlantic, you get this tiny little set of jump cuts of him sitting down in the Concorde, knocking back his short, having his passport stamped, and then he's at the other end. I just love that.
And once again, a visual language that had not been seen in that way, that was internet. I mean, internet has been around for 4 or 5 years at that time, but again, just into people, this is what you can do. And I think we're very lucky not only to have that from a British production, but also to have it to refer back to, because there's so much that this movie can do. We're going to talk about the marketing in a moment, but also to be inspired as a video creator, this movie has it all.
Yeah, and we probably have to mention Brad Pitt. Obviously, major star even at the time. And he plays this character who has this sort of jumbled up language, which is a cross between Irish, it's probably a little bit of Romanian gypsy language as well, and he's totally and utterly incoherent when he talks, unless you listen incredibly carefully to what he actually says. And that, again, there's so much humour in that, because most of the other characters in the film haven't a clue what he's talking about, and yet they then base their next set of actions on what he's said, and you think you don't know what he said, yet you're going to go ahead and do something on the back of it. It's genius.
And back to what I was saying earlier, you realise at the very end that Mickey, albeit you could have been thought of a character that doesn't really get it, was the smartest of all of them.
Absolutely right. Yeah, he played absolutely everybody. So we need to talk about the marketing, because we've talked a heck of a lot about the actual film itself. Again, it's just over 20 years old, probably not as massively overly marketed film. But what do you think about the posters?
So that was interesting. So we know that this was premiered in August 2000, then had a UK Europe release in September. It was a very long drawn out affair to get a movie released internationally. So much so that in 2001, the US and many other territories discovered Snatch for the first time. And that was almost like a second form of marketing, which led to this very interesting effect where when the movie was first marketed in 2000, there was a very distinctive style, both from the movie, but also from the poster. You may remember you had that kind of dual tone style. Yes. It had this kind of hazardous, almost kind of chemical symbol. It felt almost like a warning poster. And you had the characters there standing, looking quite menacing, looking directly at the audience. And then the following year, they went for more of an international poster, which I think lost a lot of its identity and charm. It was very much the characters, but in full color. And my issue with that, although I do understand why they did it, it doesn't match because there is a color identity in the film, particularly with the final fact, which is matched by the original poster. So, what did you make of it yourself?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think the original poster is so much more evocative of the film itself. As you say, it has the right colour palette. It focuses in on, well, it tells you the names of the characters as well, which is very important. Bricktop, Turkish, Bullet Tooth, that sort of thing. I think that's very, very important, and it gets across immediately what you're gonna get from the film, from its tone.
Yeah, I think that the original, the newer poster, which has been used now for the 20th wedding anniversary, 20th anniversary of the movie, and now the 4K release, it feels too much like Big Short and all the other type American films. But it's out of the hands of the producers. What they did do at the time, they had an official website, which may seem like a given, but this is 2000, Roger. So sadly, the website is no longer available. But there was enough articles to praise actually the use of the website to again match the style of the original poster and the style of the film. So what you would do is go online, and it was probably a Flash website, I'd imagine, where the Snatch word would start to fade out, dissolving to show the poster, and then you could click to watch and download the teaser trailer, and some scenes with the main characters.
And they've carried on marketing the film really for the whole of the 20 years, haven't they? I see videos pop up on YouTube all the time. There was an interview with Alan Ford recently, which I saw on there, and Guy Ritchie himself has done a recent reminiscence, hasn't he, of it's 20 years since Snatch, and he goes into quite a lot of detail as to how they made the film and where the ideas came from and how he directed it.
And maybe that's all a first observation, which is one could argue that the marketing campaign lacked, kind of pace and wasn't really grabbing the audience by the scruff the way the film might do. But then on the reverse, yes, you're absolutely right. For the last 21 years, people have been talking about Snatch, whether that is newspapers, for example, doing articles to give you a tour of the different pubs and location used on Snatch. So you could have your own pub crawl and be where Turkish was, or where cousin Avi waited, wait for the diamonds to be given to him. And then there was a documentary made in 2001 for the international audience, and then there was different versions. You expected DVDs, Blu-ray, and so on. But each time the actors, the producers, even the costume designers were being interviewed to reminisce about the film. And 20 years is a long time, and yet people keep talking about it, keep wanting to look at it, and they, in the process, therefore, gain new viewers. And there is now a trend on YouTube, you may have noticed, of people doing first reactions videos.
Yeah, and again, the aforementioned Bricktop as well. Such an iconic character, and again, his lines in the film I can't quote because pretty much everything he says has an F word or a C word in it. But there's a piece of unofficial Snatch related stuff if you go looking for it on YouTube, and it's called Brick Vader, and some genius has actually taken scenes from Star Wars and actually dubbed Bricktop's dialogue over Darth Vader. And And it is absolute genius and absolutely hilarious to the point of you will be rolling around on the floor laughing your head off. It is just so funny what this person's done. But that's what you can do with a character which not only is frightening in his delivery of his words, but the words themselves are just absolutely crafted to perfection. And another thing I'll say as well is whether you've bought the original DVD or the Blu-ray, or hopefully these will be on the 4K release as well, is watch the deleted scenes. Certainly on the DVD, there's about 12 minutes of deleted scenes, and some of those deleted scenes, the dialogue is equally as incredible and well written as the scenes that made it into the actual film. And you know that Ritchie's cut these scenes purely from the point of view of pacing, but those scenes are worth watching as deleted scenes because they are just as good as what remained in the movie. And some of them I'm thinking, oh, this is just joyous, you should have left it in. I know why he didn't, but they are good. So, sometimes deleted scenes in films, you know why they were deleted, because they were rubbish. Some of these deleted scenes are joyous to watch.
So there are a number of lessons that can be derived from a movie that people keep talking about 20 years later. So back to my earlier comment, perhaps a simple marketing campaign that didn't achieve a great deal, but my God, the payoff 20 years later, people are still talking about it. So for me, I'll begin, Roger. Lesson number one, I'm going to say almost kind of adopt a visual language from the choice of colors, the choice of the poster design, the way in which you're going to go for the opening credits, but a visual language which is all about the moving images, the color palettes, the texture, and stick with it throughout, because I think that'll serve you well, but will really, really make the audience believe that you put the work in. So that would be my first lesson. What about you, Roger?
Yeah, I just think that it's experimentation with storytelling, isn't it? It's that the way that they dovetail the different stories together, and that takes a lot of planning. So, you know that I'm a big fan of storytelling, whether that's in marketing copy or whether in presentations and speeches, but you can't just rock up and tell a story. You've got to plan it, you've got to script it, and you've got to get the nuances. And I think that if you watch Snatch, you'll realise just how well crafted these stories are, and that's why the film works so well.
For me, the lesson number two, if there is one, would be strong and clearly defined characters and memorable, quotable dialogues and discussions. Now, I'm very aware that this may be a stretch from a business point of view, but actually, if you want to do case studies, if you want to do product demonstrations, even sales promo, think about the messaging. Think about maybe the writing. Are you creating copy that is memorable, that is repeatable by your future customers? So I'm sure you're not going to disagree, but do you have maybe some quotes or some moments in Snatch that are your favorites?
Gosh. I mean, it's just hard to pick ones that don't involve swearing, but obviously "Feed 'em to the pigs, Errol," is one of Bricktop's lines, and I mean it sounds quite humorous when said out of context, but this guy kills people and feeds them to pigs as a way of getting rid of the evidence. What's he called? Jason Statham's character, Turkish, towards the end, they're in the caravan, and that their options are limited. And he says, "You tell me how to control a mad gypsy, and I'll tell you how to control an unhinged pig-feeding gangster." I mean, these things are just joyous. I love the two girls as well,
Yes.
who work in Doug the Head's. They're twins, obviously, in real life. And just the dialogue between, "Yeah, Dad, you told us. Yes, Dad, you told us," and they just repeat each other's lines. It's glorious. It's every line is quotable.
Pretty
Pascal.
much, which is hard. I mean, for me, cousin Avi had been Stitches back in the days in cinema, and now. So, do you know when he makes a decision to go to London, and then his kind of accomplices look at him weirdly? See, no, London, fish, chips, cup of tea, bat food, worst weather, Mary effing Poppins, London, and he just rattles this. But there's one at the end where Sorry, I'm laughing because I can see the scene where they're trying to understand where the diamond is,
Yeah.
and they've managed to kind of literally trap Vincent, Saul, and Tyrone into into a room. And he says, "I'm getting a heartburn, Tony. Do something terrible."
Do something terrible, yeah. And it's this, look in the dog. What do you mean, look in the dog?
Yes.
Open the dog up. Well, it isn't a tin of beans, is it? Oh, that's a bit rich, isn't it? It's funny. Bullet-toothed Tony is perfectly happy to shoot people, to carve people up with a sword, but, it's crossing a line when you have to hurt the dog.
Back to the humour, whereby Bullet-toothed Tony is a killer. But he's a big fan of Madonna. He's got Lucky Stars blasting through the speakers on his phone. So we must move on to the next lesson. And for me, this is inspired by a comment that 𝗖𝗍𝗂𝗃 gave during a documentary for lesson number 3, is to be a counterexample of the current trend. So he took a view of what the world thought of British film production, and he realized they were either costume drama or kind of sad, depressing social commentaries. And he said, I'm going to flip it and be a counterexample and show them what else we can do. So back to your viewers and listeners, take a look at what is happening and what is the norm in your sector industry and flip it, change the style and the genre and become a counterexample.
Yeah, and I guess lesson number 4, and we've already alluded to this with the videos that have appeared on YouTube from 𝗖𝗍𝗂𝗃 and others over the course of the last 20 years, is to always revisit your content and get new reactions to it, updated reviews, updated reactions, updated perspectives, and that way you can keep your content alive and current.
Yeah, superb, Roger. If I may, just because I love it so much, when I was watching, when I went to the cinema for the first time to see Snatch, I was in London. I went to the Prince Charles, so UK and London-based viewers and listeners will know, very special cinema, Prince Charles, for real film goers. And it was this very, very odd double bill of Daylight with Sylvester Stallone and Snatch.
Yes.
Why not? And I think you paid very little money. And I sat there. Daylight was okay. And then I'm sat there watching Snatch. And I knew that I would enjoy the film visually from the opening credits. But I knew this is exactly the kind of thing I wanted to watch when quite early on, the character of Tommy has bought a gun.
Yes.
And Turkish discovers he has a gun, and you ask him, why do you have a gun? And Tommy say, it's for protection. And Turkish says, protection from what? The Germans? And I just laughed out loud, and I thought, this is going to be a blast.
And again, that's another repeated motif that comes up through because he says the Germans a number of times during the film. Pascal, we could talk about Snatch all day, we've already talked about it a lot today, which just goes to show what a great film it is and what marketing lessons we can gain from it. But we've come to the end of another episode of Two Geeks and a Marketing Podcast, episode 46. Thank you everyone for listening. Thank you everybody for watching. Do please give us some feedback, leave some comments on the YouTube channel, talk to us on Twitter. We do appreciate anything that you give us as feedback. It helps us to shape the show for the future. That's it from us for this week. So until next time, go out there and make sure that your marketing is done right. I was Roger Edwards and he was Pascal Fintoni.